Okay, so far everything that we've talked about in the Gothic has been French. We've been really looking at what's going on in France. So I do want to look at what's happening in this time period, in this style, in other parts of Europe. So in the Romanesque, we specifically took an aside and looked at Italy. So for Gothic, we're going to look at England, and then we're also going to look at Germany. Okay. So, England. The classic example of English Gothic is Salisbury Cathedral. One of the things that we see in a lot of the kind of British version, the British incantations of the Gothic, are linear patterning, horizontality. So rather than the emphasis being vertical, 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 how high can we make this thing before it collapses, we see more of an interest in kind of these horizontal bands of structure, okay? This building is started in 1220. That's the same year as Amiens, which we looked at when we were looking at French architecture. We have another thing in the British version of this is we have a very light or sparing use of flying buttresses. There's a couple right over here you can see in the transept, but there aren't a lot of them like we see in French Gothic architecture. The facade, the screen, do I have a picture of this? The screen is wider in the facade than the nave, so it kind of sticks out further on the side. Sorry, I don't have a slide of that. I don't know why I didn't include that. So that's kind of a British thing. We have an emphasis rather than on the westwork with the towers like we see in French Gothic. The emphasis instead is on the crossing towers. So we do have these big crossing towers that are over where the nave and the transept cross, right? Remember we have that crossing square, so they build very large towers there. Okay, so let's look at the interior. We definitely see the lineage of the French Gothic architecture. We've got our bundled columns, we've got our nice pointy arches, we have our pointy ribbed groin vaults, we have our groin vaults in the aisles over here. We have lots of nice big windows. We have stained glass, though we don't have as much of it in England as we do in France. Here is another example. This is Gloucester. And Gloucester is significant for a few reasons. Same kind of thing as before, big crossing tower. We have some flying buttresses, but not many. More of a horizontal vibe than in France. We do have our pointed windows here. But then we really see at Gloucester the first development of another specified style. This is something I will ask you on your final, those of you in my class, those of you who are just random internet people, you don't have to take the final. But the style that emerges here in England is called the perpendicular style. Okay, so the perpendicular style takes its name from the pronounced verticality of its decorative details. So we kind of have an emphasis on when things come up from the bottom vertically and hit or intersect the horizontality of the ceiling. And then they spread out into these kind of fans. There is no structural purpose to all of this elaborate stonework, all these kind of fans of stone tracery. The decorative elements in the ribbing and vaulting, it's all just decorative, okay? So it's not doing anything structural. But it is quite elaborate and beautiful. So this is the cloisters in Gloucester, and we can see that we have these fan vaults, which are, the fan vaults are the main kind of attribute of the perpendicular style. So I'm saying perpendicular style a lot because that is a thing that you are going to be asked on either a quiz or a final exam or both. Here's another view of that. All these fan vaults, really kind of amazing, delicate masonry being done. Here's another view of Gloucester. This is in the transept. So sometimes this vaulting has what are called pendants, which are these kind of, in the beginning, they're kind of like this. They're close to the top. They're often gilded, and they're just sort of like these little additional decorative layers on top of the extensive fan work. But then that becomes more elaborate over time, and we actually have things hanging down, which is where they get the name pendant. Okay, here is the tomb of Edward II. This is commissioned by Edward III. That's Edward II's son. And this is considered one of the sort of introductions of this more elaborate Gothic style in England. So we see this tomb, which we have the sarcophagus below, and then we have this very elaborate architectural kind of thing that really reminds me of the flamboyant style in France. Okay, so now we're going to look at another example of the perpendicular style, and this is the Chapel of Henry VII. So this adjoins Westminster Abbey, which is one of the most famous buildings in London. We do know who designed this. It's Robert and William Virtue designed this chapel, and it's built between 1503 and 1519. Okay, so inside we can see the continuation of the perpendicular style, and we can see these elaborate pendants coming off the fan vaults. So this is kind of the further evolution of this kind of style. You can also see a reference to the Gothic in that we have these architectural canopies over our statuary, which we looked at when we were looking at French Gothic sculpture as well. And here's just a look at that ceiling from below. So you can see how elaborate this is. It kind of reminds me of like architectural embroidery. Like, for some reason this makes me think of needlework, of all the elaborate kind of stitch work you can do with embroidery. So we have these, what I would call mature fan vaults. This is definitely an English thing. You don't really see this in other areas of Gothic. We have the large hanging pendants. We have the dissolution of the structural Gothic into this very decorative kind of fantasy. So before, all the ribs in the vaulting were structural. Those ribbed groin vaults were helping hold everything up. And in the perpendicular, we just kind of build and build and build on that until it's just decorative and it's just kind of embellishment instead of being structural. Okay. This is just another view. All right, so next we're going to talk about Germany.